Today, I'm delighted and honoured to welcome an old friend of mine, the renowned British mentalist and magician Philip Escoffey, whose performances combine elements of psychological manipulation, illusion, and plenty of dry wit. Philip's live theatre shows have drawn audiences all over the world, from the Edinburgh Fringe to Sydney Opera House, where his show Six Impossible Things Before Dinner became the longest running one-man show in its history. He's also appeared on numerous TV shows as well as countless select corporate events. However, since marrying and starting a family with actress and singer Elise Fabrice, Philip has shunned the limelight over recent years to enjoy life at home with Elise and their two young sons, while supporting the creative work of other professional performers. While Philip's work often revolves around the themes of mind reading, telepathy, and psychic phenomena, his focus is grounded in the art of mentalism and actively challenging supernatural belief in all its forms. Originally a student of psychology from the University of Exeter, he uses techniques from psychology, suggestion, and misdirection to explore the many ways that our perceptions can be manipulated, and to hold a mirror up to ask why we think and believe the things we do. As Philip says, I'm not here to prove that I have powers, I'm here to challenge how you view the mind. As such, Philip has taken a centuries-old genre of entertainment, often lacking in fresh approaches, and reshaped it to ask new questions, converging his own interests in how the human mind works within a performative framework that leaves audiences spellbound. Here on the Flow State podcast, we're here to explore how different creative people get to their ideas, how they find the fortitude to push through doubts and procrastination and produce something different and fresh in a world that does little to encourage us. So I couldn't be more glad and grateful to talk to Philip about his professional life and ask him for some personal insights on how he finds his inspiration. Philip, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for that robust introduction.
Maybe
It's nice to be reminded of former days of glory.
I think, the memory still lives. I think there are places in Australia where you're still a household name, as I understand it.
Undoubtedly.
So let's go back to the very start. I should also say that we're old friends and shared a room at university together. And so by the time I first met you, our room in our hall of residence was full of big illusion magic props, big boxes, the Mismade Lady section cases, and things that you could be locked in a trunk and do escapology and all sorts of things like that. But that isn't where you are today. So let's go back to the start and where you began. What's your first memory of experiencing magic and illusion? Do you remember?
I have a vivid memory of my father performing a trick. He had two tricks that he did, and I think enjoyed doing them. One was a series of balls of newspaper appearing under a hat. And the hat would be shown empty, he'd put it down, and my memory of that's quite vague, but knowing what I know now, I've got a sense of what he probably was doing, and balls would appear. But my strongest memory was of a relatively simple card trick, which involved a card being selected, as it often does, and then these two crosses of four cards being made and a selection by myself, which cross did I want, which two cards from that cross, which card from those two cards, and the card I ended up choosing was the card I'd originally picked. And this I know had quite a profound effect on me. I think probably as much the reaction I saw it getting when he did it on other people. I think that tickled me on some level. I wanted some of that. I was quite a needy child in the attention stakes growing up. So anything that could garner me more of it was a good thing. So that's probably my first memory of seeing a magic trick and being beguiled by the how of it, but also delighted by the attention it seemed to garner.
Yeah, I mean there are different parts to this, aren't there? There is the kind of how on earth did that just happen? But then there's also the interest in performance and a means of channeling attention to yourself. And I think we'll come on to that a bit more as we carry on with this conversation. So then you went into it full on, didn't you? I think you had the Paul Daniels, you started out like lots of young children did back in the day.
Yeah, the Paul Daniels magic sets weren't quite around when I originally started. There were the trips up to London's finest magic emporium, Davenport's at the time, which was in the in the arcades under Charing Cross Station, and that was a very exciting visit. You went into this literally magical shop, and it had a touch of the, I'm going to age myself here, a touch of the Mr. Ben, who went into this magical shop where magical things happened, and you'd saved up your money. And I remember buying my first big purchase, which was a thing called a sliding die box, which was a well-made wooden prop. And in about 1982, I want to say, give or take 2 or 3 years either way, I bought this for £35, which was about £1 million in today's money, and that was huge. And those visits were relatively frequent. Another thing bought, and this is back in the day where you just thought, I can buy more tricks. This will make me a good magician, which of course is not the case. As a little aside, that there's a saying in our world that a professional magician knows 6 or 7 different tricks that they show to thousands of different people, and an amateur magician knows thousands of different tricks that they show to the same 6 or 7 people. And at that point, I was very much somebody who was learning dozens, hundreds, thousands of tricks and showing them to the poor 6 or 7 people. My parents couldn't have a dinner party between about 1983 and 1986 without their guests having some kind of magical spectacular imposed on them. And so that was the sort of the origin of it. And not long after that, I mean, there's other things happened, but not long after that, you would have met me, by which point I got a bit more serious. As you say, I arrived with a couple of very big and expensive boxes. One was, as you say, a thing called the Mismade Lady, which stood 7 or 8 feet high and a few feet wide. So that was a big lump of stuff to have in a relatively small room. And then another thing called a substitution trunk, which was a trick made famous by Harry Houdini, and that involved, two people sort of switching places very quickly and seemingly impossibly. But again, another big lump. So although my memory of it isn't that clear, at that point I was clearly wanting to do those kind of big razzle dazzle, any kind of soundtrack. And if allowed, I can tell the listeners and viewers that Piers would now wax lyrical for a good 5 minutes about my, let's say, eclectic, he might say awful taste in dramatic music. But it was things like the opening credits to Terminator, it was Danny Elfman's Batman, it was Jean-Michel Jarre, it was these kinds of very dun 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 da 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 kind of pieces, which suited the cliched magic act of the time. Anyway, so that's kind of where I was. I was everything you could imagine. Throwing a couple of glittery waistcoats in my early teens, a bow tie or two, and I guess you're starting to get a bit of an impression of what sort of adorable human being I must have been.
Definitely. Although you did really fill up the room with all your gear, I must say. But it was kind of a good talking point when people came in. But I think it goes to show, doesn't it, what to you would have seemed natural was to outside eyes must have been really clear that you had this deep and abiding passion for this relatively esoteric subject. And of course, you dived into that pool as deeply as you could. And that kind of that description of like, when I was little, going out for a treat would be to go to the toy shop. But obviously for you, it was going to the magic shop, which sounds very kind of Hogwarts and
Yeah.
enchanting in itself. And that just goes to show. And the fact that, when I think about if my children were insisting on doing magic tricks for my friends, it would be pretty clear that this boy's got a passion. He's got an interest. He's you got the bug, hadn't you? Quite clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were probably many, many like me. So at that point, it's still not such a novelty. It's less of a novelty than the parents whose children play a piece on a particular instrument. There's probably more of them, but it's in that vein. That's what it was. It was my thing, and as I say, being quite an extrovert in the true sense of the word. And by that I mean an extrovert who needs their energy, their sense of self, their affirmation from an external source rather than the introvert who takes it from within. My brother was very much the introvert, didn't need 5 people to witness something for it to matter. That didn't have any sort of effect on him at all. He did it for itself, its own sake. So his hobbies were much more solitary. They were airfix models, it was painting, it was art, it was these much more solitary pursuits. So in that sense, I just found something which was probably a bit more suited to the extrovert. There is a cliche in the magic world that a lot of people get into it because they're not very comfortable as human beings, and so they hide behind their magic tricks. That wasn't me. That I wasn't that sort of archetype of the kid who can't look someone in the eye, but when they've got a pack of cards in their hands, are a little emboldened by it. I just wanted to be, we all want to be a bit different. We want to think our views on things are cleverer, smarter, more original, more creative, and I guess magic ticked a lot of those boxes.
Yeah, so you obviously you do what anyone would do when they find a genre or a passion or an interest, and you explore its breadth and depth as far as you can. As you said, you learn thousands of tricks rather than specializing. But there's obviously an important journey you have to go on if you're going to take this to the next level, which is to define your space within the bigger genre. So if you're playing an instrument, then that could take you into any one of 1,000 different corners of what music's all about. And in magic, you went. It's interesting what you just said about not needing to create a persona so much, because that's the cliche of the magician, is that they're a kind of a mysterious person that's kind of a bit kooky. But actually, I know you so well, and I've seen you working. You were a very personal and personable magician, and even just socially, you have a great knack for tuning in to individuals in a group and finding the best thing that will get them talking and connecting. And so there's a large aspect of this which is about engagement, personal engagement. Is that the thing? Because I don't know how you get from big illusion magic, all the obvious stuff, the kind of David Copperfieldy kind of approach, which one expects, and the Westcott's and all this kind of stuff, into a much more stripped down approach, which is all really about the mind and how the mind works and mentalism. How did you find that niche?
So we've sort of jumped a decade or so, but that decade, a lot happened and not a lot happened, in the sense that whilst I was at university with you, and I was doing a psychology degree, and my final year research was on the psychology of belief and need, and whether there was a connection between personality type and a sort of a proclivity to believe in faith-based products. Just trying to sort of explain it succinctly. Do we believe in the things we do because of our personalities? Do our beliefs form our personalities? Is it a two-way exchange? So all of that was happening. I was very interested why we believe the things that we believe. I then wasn't really doing any magic. I got a post-grad job in sort of some kind of dead-end marketing sort of area and did that. And then in about 1999, so when I was just approaching 30, decided to jack it all in and run away and join the circus, as it were. And by that point, I was aware of the branch of magic that was mentalism, this idea that you persuade people that you can either read their minds or influence their thoughts. And that intrigued me, not because it intrigued me because of what it did to the audience that none of the other branches of magic that I was aware of did. If I make a hanky disappear in front of somebody like you, you admire the skill, you say that's very clever, I don't know where the hanky's gone, but you don't start questioning whether I have some mastery over the world of physics that up until now no one did. You say it's a trick. It's a clever trick. I don't know how you did it, but it's a trick. There's something about mentalism that seems to bypass that cognitive process in most people. So you do something in the world of mentalism. I influence you to make a choice, or I seemingly preempt a choice you're going to make, or you've made your decision and I somehow know what it is. These all have very real take-home appeal. You don't watch a man saw a woman in half and go, that would be great. If only I could do that tomorrow. It just has nothing that that's useful. But the skills of a mentalist do. And as Robert Maxwell said, you can tell anybody any lie as long as it's the lie they want to hear. Telling somebody that I have these powers, these sort of Jedi, Derren Brown, psychic-y, whatever you want to sort of categorize them as, those powers are very appealing. So on some level, people stop applying the same cognitive rigor that they do to a hanky disappearing or a pen going through a banknote or whatever the trick may be. They don't apply that same rigor to the mentalist's offering. And I think a big part of that, as I say, is because they want to believe the narrative given by the mentalist. So in the case of someone like Uri Geller, he claims that it's some God-given psychic ability. And someone like Derren Brown claims it's some high-level psychological understanding. He has such an exquisite understanding of the human condition that with a selection of very well-placed words and gestures and ideas can control what it is you're thinking and doing. I was reluctant to go down any of those paths and decided that what I was doing was spectacular enough. I didn't need to be spectacular, which for those that know me well, probably is a bit of a surprise, but to remove myself and ego from it. But I was serving a higher ego, I think, because I knew ultimately the rewards would come and I would be associated with them. So it's not that I was so able to just sort of shut down my own needs, but I did feel quite strongly that I didn't need to be anything special in the sense that people would want to imbue me, given half, you don't have to do much as a mentalist to have people thinking, oh my God, it's so amazing what you do. And then I thought, more than just not needing to sort of claim that I have this power or that ability, what if I strip myself right back? And that was the origins of this character, the Grey Man. So I would turn up to corporate events as the Grey Man. And it wasn't that I didn't tell people my real name, but I didn't advertise it either. I didn't want it to be, oh, yeah, it would be weird. But what's your real name? The Grey Man? No, it's not. Fuck off. So the Grey Man the idea was I was whatever you wanted me to be. So as an audience, if you're watching me and you desperately want to believe that I have psychic powers, I wasn't doing anything to disavow you of it, although I was gently, over the period of time I'd spend with you, maybe making you question whether that might not be true. Similarly, if you wanted to believe that I was sort of more from the Derren school of very intuitive, sort of Sherlock Holmesian deduction, again, I would slowly, if you wanted to hear it, you'd hear that there was a narrative of me disavowing you of that view, but I wasn't overtly explicit with it. And then any other thing you wanted to imbue me with, I could kind of fit that, but I wasn't anything. It was quite nebulous, the Grey Man. And that interested me because I'd got quite bored cutting women in half after a while. Just a sentence I never thought I'd say.
Because
But
you're on
it's true.
record saying that now, Philip. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad I am on some level because I would. I've cut another woman in half.
Mm,
What are you doing
yeah.
with all the bits? Oh no, I put them back together. Oh right, that's good. It's slightly pointless endeavor, isn't it?
Mm,
I mean, I know everything's pointless artistically. What painting is but this seems particularly pointless. It really is just about garnering the, oh my goodness, how did you do that?
yeah.
But it drifts too much for me into the, why did you do that?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I remember you mentioning years ago that you worked alongside the guy that eats light bulbs and lit cigarettes for a living, and of
Yeah.
course that is amazing. But he found himself kind of trapped in this world where that's what he had to do every night, and it quickly became quite unpleasant for him. And
Yeah.
I think
The
you can find yourself
regurgitator.
hampered, can't you, by the decisions you make?
Yeah, I mean, listen, each to their own and all that, and that he was making a very good living, and his act is extraordinary. I mean, why are you doing it? I guess is the question he wants you to ask on some level. Why are you swallowing 3 goldfish and then bringing back 3 live goldfish? Or so I think that's slightly different. I think going back to somebody like David Copperfield, but we're drifting into different areas here because he's still doing what he does, but I'm not quite sure why he still does it. He has more money than he could ever spend in his life. And from what I hear, quite often the performances look a bit sort of dialed in and lackluster. He has done millions and millions and millions of hours on stage, and there I feel there's a certain trapped by what you're doing. But we're digressing slightly. So for me, the origin into the draw towards mentalism was it provoked a different set of questions to any other branch of magic, and that interested me. Being somebody who's a very amateur student of the human condition, why we do what we do, why we're motivated by the things we're motivated by, mentalism seemed a really good way of presenting that.
Mm.
And I think why I landed on this, much less showy form of magical performance.
Yeah, and the Grey Man sounds like such a great brand. Working in kind of creative marketing as I do, I really love your description of it as it's sort of It makes me think of the X-Files. There's a degree of mystery to it, but what it's enigmatic. It's a very enigmatic kind of framing, isn't it? I can see it makes sense very quickly, the idea of the grey man. But you dispensed with that, didn't you? And you're now, as a performer, through your most public period of performance, you've been Philip Escoffey, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, the grey man is great, but again, as a marketeer, the slight problem with it is you're not putting yourself front and center. So actually, anybody could be the grey man. It suffers a bit like the Blue Man Group. If one of the three performers in the Blue Man Group starts saying, "Oh, I don't want to do this anymore," fine, just get another bloke and get him to shave his head and put some blue paint on him. So in that sense, you want people to want you as a performer. So it worked corporately, but then when things evolved for me and I started doing my own theatre shows, I think it was also I wrote a game show for Channel 5 called Impossible, which was a sort of magic game show, which I presented as well. And it's just difficult being the grey man unless you're already very, very established as this sort of esoteric character.
Yeah.
Philip Escoffey emerged from behind the grey man. But it had done its job. I mean, it got me the corporate bookings that I wanted to get. So that would be from about 2000 to 2008. For 8 years, I was doing that. Then I did my first Edinburgh Fringe in 2008, which led me to going to Australia in 2009. And then by 2010, that's when I was doing my own show at Sydney Opera House. And then in 2012, I joined the Illusionists. And then I retired.
Let's go back. He's officially said he's retired. I let the people hear that. Tears across the magical world.
Mm.
I hope you haven't retired, Philip. I hope there's more of you to come.
Well, I have. I haven't. Yeah, yeah. It's a very long sabbatical if it's not a retirement. But anyway, either way, I'm not
So
doing
let's go
anything at the
back though,
moment.
because lots of people are in a job that isn't exactly their raison d'etre, and they often yearn to make the break, to make the change, and it's a hard thing to do for anyone. And there's a lot of risk and doubt and mental bogeymen that come in to stop you doing the things you need to do. And yet you did it. What can you recall what gave you the oomph and the courage to put together a pathway that would take you out of the job that wasn't satisfying you and into a world that was more suited to your passion?
Yeah, yeah. There's probably a number of elements that come together to create that environment where you do make that sort of transition, which does come with its own perils and potential um, pitfalls. A big part of it is an old school friend called Ed, who had great confidence in me as a performer. That was very sweet of him, and felt that I should be doing that, and was very much the sort of guy saying, "Look, you just take the step. I'll manage you." Well, he wasn't an entertainment manager. He's in commercial property. I'll get you all the bookings. You just turn up and be brilliant. And I had absolute faith in him. Now, the irony of it is, and I rib him mercilessly to this day, that I think to date, if he's got me one booking, that's certainly the most. But I'm not sure if he's even got me one. But I'm still eternally grateful to him, because without him in this mix of ingredients, I wouldn't have done it. So that was a big part. I think you need to feel the discomfort of what you're in to make you want to move. If it's too sort of tolerable, then that's dangerous. So you don't want to feel ambivalent towards what it is you're currently doing. You need to actively dislike it. And then the thing that's attracting you in the other direction has to be glittering at a certain level. I don't know if there is a scale for how glittery something is, but it needs to be quite glittery. So that sort of the spike that's coming into your back from behind and the shiny, smiley, happy thing that's pulling you forward, plus a lubricant like Ed, and then on very pragmatic levels, not having children at that point in my life. That would have affected my decision, I think, because it's not then just me that's eating cold beans out of a tin if it all goes pear-shaped. So those kind of elements. There was a parent's house that I could have gone back to live in had everything gone horribly wrong and rent couldn't be paid or whatever was going on at that point in my life. So I think it's the perfect storm of conditions that helped do that. My input into it was I consciously decided to make that step towards the end of the year. I remember doing it in October, and I'd approached a couple of event organisers at that point because I knew the run up to the Christmas period was where sort of vast majority of performers earn between a quarter and a third of their annual income in the month of December because of all the Christmas parties and things going on at that time of the year. And I knew that an event organizer who maybe had 2 or 3 magicians that they use regularly wouldn't have any extra work normally, but in December they might have their 2 or 3 magicians out and another party that was also wanting a magician that they didn't have. So I was more likely to then get onto their ladder.
Yeah.
And then I felt confident that once I'd done that, and that confidence was probably a bit misplaced looking back, but I did feel confident that once I'd done that, they would want to use me again. All an event organizer really wants from you as a performer is to hear he turned up on time, he was very personable and polite, he was dressed appropriately, and he didn't offend any of our guests. The impressiveness of the tricks you do is actually quite far down as far as the event organizer is concerned. If you think of it, they're doing everything from putting in fancy decorations to an ice sculpture to a band to a bar, whatever it is they're doing. They just don't want a phone call 20 minutes before the event saying, "Where's the magician?"
Yeah.
Or they don't want a phone call 20 minutes into the event saying the magician has got a personal hygiene problem or, whatever. They just don't want any problems from you. So if you can go and be unproblematic, you're going a long way. If you happen to know a trick or two, that can only help.
Yeah.
But I have done one gig for 3 hours where I literally didn't do a single trick.
A successful gig? Was that okay?
This was a mingling at a big event. I was very over that by now. I didn't really enjoy them. Certain types of gigs. I've always liked 40 or 50 people, and you get these monster Christmas parties where there's 1,000 people from Kelly Girls recruitment or whatever. And they're just horrible because everyone is really drunk very quickly and it's loud and you can disappear very easily without anyone noticing. Invariably, they've got 6 or 7 magicians going around performing. So I did a mixture of walking around and sitting in cubicles in lavatories.
So yeah, that makes complete sense. But you've evoked, yeah. So I guess another factor, just to finish off the making the jump bit, is I'm guessing you could have probably started it iteratively. You were probably able to continue doing your day job and do a few gigs in the evenings and sort of.
No, I gave up. I didn't do. I thought I was going to do that, but I didn't. In the end, I gave up my job and then I started doing the next job.
That's brave, definitely.
Perhaps it wasn't brave because brave implies that I was, I had some deliberate agency in it. I didn't really. I was slightly a passenger to a process. I'd handed in my notice, which, as I remember, was a month, and it was coming to, or 2 months, and it was coming to an end at the end of October. And I thought in those 2 months I will get all kinds of things done. I just didn't. Not because I couldn't, because I was idle, really, and I didn't have anything approaching any kind of flow, let alone a state. It was just don't need to, don't know quite. Fear is a massive, that fear of I don't know what to do, so I'll do nothing because
Yeah,
then I can't get it wrong. It's a bit like go to see a doctor about a back problem. They don't know what to do, so I'll just tell you to do nothing. Lie in a bed. That can't hurt, can it? It's that sort of do no harm.
I think that's a really major impediment to creative flow and productivity. And you saying, I'm not sure it's quite true what you said. Is like, I'll decide to do nothing. If the decision is made, it's being made at a really deep level that you're not really conscious of until someone goes, "How's it going with this plan of yours to do X?" And you go, "Well, I haven't really got a lot done." Or you'll kind of talk about some kind of low level endeavor that sort of points towards the prize but doesn't really
Yeah.
take you closer to your goal. So I guess what you did was you gave yourself a push and you gave yourself time, and then you didn't fill that space of time as effectively as you could have done. But there came a point when you had a gig and you must have had to sort of put something together, right? So you would have had a back pocket full of close-up work that you could take to a gig.
Yeah, but of course, the specifics of the environment of a close-up gig are nothing like what you'd done up until then. You'd done tricks on friends in pubs. You'd done tricks around a dinner table. It was all very conducive to it going well. Here, you're suddenly in a sort of darkish room, and you're approaching people you don't know. But there, I think I had an advantage over a lot of other magicians. I'm quite comfortable with people. I enjoy exploring new people, and I sort of did that bit well. I think my magic was very my magic, but the tricks I was doing was pretty poor looking back, probably. And the mentalist thing hadn't completely sort of emerged yet. I was still doing more traditional sort of magic tricks. And this will come up later probably, but the whole what I don't need more time. What I need is a deadline, which I believe is Duke Ellington who said that, was absolutely true. And you said it. You book in your first gig, right? Well, that's that then. I've got to turn up at 6 o'clock on Tuesday the 4th and do some magic tricks, whatever that involves. But as I say, me turning up on time, me being presentable, me being able to speak to clients without offending them, that all served me well.
Yeah, and you are really good with people. I can testify to that. All manner of people. But nonetheless, when I picture myself going to those first, if I were in your shoes, going to those first gigs, working a room, alcohol's involved. You've already said that, a drunk volunteer, participant, is not a useful participant, right? They're like the opposite of useful. But people are going to be
Yeah.
tipsy to some degree, aren't they? I remember you've talked about the difficulty of working tables where people are sat down at the end of a meal, and you might have celebrities. You mentioned Jeremy Clarkson once. And so I'm picturing a table full of celebrities that are all probably very interested in each other and the sounds of their own voices. And you, who they probably haven't heard of, have to pipe up and break into that. So, like, how do you work a room? How do you work a table and get into their consciousness so they want to stop their conversations and listen to you? Have you got any?
Yeah, actually, Jeremy Clarkson wasn't at a table. Jeremy Beadle off of Game for a Laugh. He was. Let's not speak ill of the deceased. HTL, as my wife and I say about some people's children, hard to like. Yeah. Tables are just horrible because, as you say, they're sitting down, they're eating a meal, they're invariably packed in quite tight, so there's not much space for you to sort of get in between. There are some performers out there who thrive at tables, and I think they're unique and in the vast minority, but some can. Most think they're good at tables, they're not. I wasn't good at a table, but I knew I wasn't, which is a start. So you're squeezing in between two people, and they're immediately forced to sort of either carry on eating their meal, which feels rude to them, although some people didn't have a problem with that, and good on them. But most people felt this sort of need to crane their necks round, so they were looking at you. Quite often, you'd have some enormously extravagant centerpiece in the table, which meant that four people, or five even, if it was a table of 10, couldn't really see much of what was going on because there was barrage of ostrich feathers between me and them. So you've got two people hooked up. You've got five people who can't really see, and then there's a couple of others who sort of can see, but might have just been saying, and just as my wife was about to leave me, would anyone like to see a trick?
Yeah,
And not that I introduced myself to the table like that, but I much preferred having to go up to tables if I'd been able to work the drinks reception. Because if I'd done the drinks, if I knew I was doing a drinks reception and had to do the tables after, and tables were the first thing I jettisoned when financially I could afford to, I just wouldn't do that anymore. I'd say to clients, happily work during the drinks reception, happily do a bit to the whole group after dessert or before dessert, and then carry on working afterwards during coffee or whatever. But not by coffee, one or two people have got up from the table. Later, actually, thinking back now, as I was able to do, I started demanding I will do tables, but there has to be an empty chair at each table for me.
mm.
And some clients went for that, some didn't, understandably, because that's a lot of chairs to be not sat in for 90% of the time. But those that really wanted me, and it was invariably clients who'd used me before and knew what they were getting and liked it, and they would sort of accommodate that. That worked fine because then I'm sat with you, I'm a guest, lovely. So how you would manage it badly is the answer with tables. If I had met some of them during the drinks reception, that worked well because I'd go up to the table and and Maureen would say, "Oh God, I just saw this guy earlier. You guys have got to watch." Now, immediately you've got a champion at the table, and that helps a bit sometimes. But
Yeah.
if Maureen's not particularly liked, then no one listens to Maureen, and you have no idea of knowing if Maureen's going to be someone who sort of carries any weight. In terms of going up to groups of people at a standing thing, there your job is to really spot the groups that need someone like you to come and interrupt them and those that don't. And I think a lot of magicians make the mistake of seeing a group of people all having a great time and think they look fun. I'll go to them. And it might be that you do have a fun time there. They might be having a great time and really lovely. And although they're just about to tell a brilliant joke and you've cut straight across it, they still let you in. Sometimes it doesn't work out. They resent you for coming up and interrupting the flow of what was going on for them. Either way, I think those groups should be left alone. At some point, one of them, if you're doing a good job, will hear about you and invite you into their group later on and say, "Oh, could you come and see us next?" Lovely. That's the best way to get into a group, to be invited in. But initially, you go up to the 2 or 3 people sometimes who are clutching their champagne glasses, have an HDR, a high drink rate. So the glass is going up to their lips very frequently, which implies they don't quite know what to do with themselves. So you're an absolute welcome break to the evening they're having so far. So it's spotting them, spotting those groups that need something. And then you leave them with this very neutral thing to discuss. So maybe they don't know each other well. It's a corporate event, and by the time you've finished, you've given them something neutral and non-work related to talk about. So that's a nice thing.
Job done. There's a lot of energetics, the sort of invisible reading of the energies at a table. If it's a complete circle of people all talking with each other, then breaking into that circle is tough. If there's an empty chair for you to then occupy, or if the circle's been broken and some people have got up for coffee, then again there's an open gate for you to walk through. And similarly, absolutely. And it's very smart what you say about the fun people are happy in and of themselves, but the people that you can kind of save from themselves by being that third party distraction, that's really interesting. Yeah. And so
and this drags us awkwardly towards this concept of a flow state, because that's whatever your endeavor in life is, you're trying to get to this point of, and perhaps you need to preempt that with a bit of explanation of what the flow state is. I don't know, but I'm trying to optimize how well I do what I do. And going up to a group that doesn't resent me coming there because they were having a lovely time without me, going up to a group that actively encourages me to be there because they needed something to help break the slight awkwardness. These are all things that then make me feel much more at ease. And when I'm at ease, I'm going to do much better work than if I'm worried or anxious. Have I got this right? Did I read this situation right? So all of these things that aren't in any of the books, really, when you're learning how to be a close-up wandering minstrel, they're all crucial in getting you to that point where you're doing the best you possibly can.
Yeah, that's being at ease, being grounded, centered. Yeah. That's fundamental and difficult in the public eye, because when you're communicating with others in any walk of life, you're constantly being pulled out of yourself into the middle, the liminal space between you and that other person, or thinking of the future, what's about to happen, or thinking or regretting something in the past. It's very hard to stay in the moment. I think it's a power of yours to be like forever, or you have great presence. And I think that's probably a fundamental ingredient, isn't it, to being a performer, especially when you've got to be so flexible. This is a really flexible way of working. It's not like you've got a band behind you, you're going to sing the 10 songs that you were expecting to sing. You've got to kind of flex to whatever the occasion is asking of you.
There's definitely a jazz element to it. Yeah.
But then sorry, go on.
No, go on.
Well, I was going to say that then you pivoted away from having got this very jazz way of working your art down to a T. You then gave yourself a new challenge, which is to take it to the proscenium arch, to the stage, to put on a theatre show, which must be a quite... I mean, it's really interesting, the journey you must have had to go on. So I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong, you obviously had your groove of, you'd left illusion behind, and you'd left like tricks behind to move more to kind of close up. How do we all think? How do our perceptions work? Let me confound what you think you're expecting with this thing and connect on a personal level, to suddenly having to address a whole room. And to do that, it must be more thematic, right? It's not just kind of I've got these 10 or so different ways I can talk to this small group at a social function. It's like I'm going to do A, B, C, D, E, and F, following an art.
Yeah, the dynamic's very different because this is a room full of people who've paid to come and see you.
Right.
So in one sense, it's much more sort of luxuriant for you as a performer. It's much more indulgent. They're gonna sit and listen for a lot longer. I mean, I was always, if you spoke to the colleagues that I worked with a lot when I was doing the close-up thing, I think a theme you might get is I could sometimes be with a small group of people for 5 or 6 minutes before I've done anything because my thinking was if they don't care about me, and this applies to whether you're a singer or whatever your art form is, if they don't care about you, then they won't care about your art so much. So I wanted, I wanted them to metaphorically sniff my bottom whilst I sniffed theirs. And I figured then what I wanted from them would be much, much easier because now we had some kind of rapport, we had some kind of relationship. With a theatrical audience, you kind of that's already implicit. They've handed over money to come and see you. In the close-up environment, you're imposing yourself on people who don't know who you are, didn't ask for you to come and see them, and often have a preconceived idea about what a magician is. And I think that was part of my journey towards being the grey man, almost preempting your visceral reaction to what you think a magician's going to be, which is for some people this horrible experience where a young person who in real life is normally perfectly charming, but suddenly when they've got a pack of cards in their hand, become this slightly sort of snake oily, fast speaking horror, really. Who I've seen close up magicians come up to a group of people and go, "Hi, my name's Barry. Do you want to see a trick?" "Yeah, I'm Barry." What's your name?" "Steve." "Great, Steve. And what do you do?" "I'm an astronaut." "That's great. Do you want to see a trick?" "No, shut the fuck up, Barry. He just said he was an astronaut. Did you hear that? That's more interesting than anything you're going to do. Adapt. This is jazzy. Let's not do tricks for the next 10 minutes. Let's, if Steve's up for it, talk about what it's like to go into space, because I'm sure that's more interesting than how that coin got into that box.
Mm.
And I pick a deliberately exaggerated example, but I've seen things pretty similar to that because they're so on autopilot. They so have no feeling for other human beings. They have a great feeling for a pack of cards and how to manipulate it, and technically infinitely better than I will ever be. But that doesn't really matter, does it? Because no one wants to watch Barry and his infinitely better than me technical skills, because nothing about Barry says, please do more.
Yeah.
It says Barry's just screaming, please leave us alone. Or making them want to scream, please leave us alone. So that's a big difference when you're in the theatre. I'd avoided doing any kind of after dinner. I said I got to a point where I was doing mingling at the reception and then maybe something after dinner to the whole group. But for a long time, I was talking clients out of that, making them believe it wouldn't work. But the truth was, I didn't have a show of any sort and I didn't know what to do. And I hid behind, oh, no, I think it'd be much better if I just mingled again after the meal. And, you know, that was daft because you earn more money if you do a stage show. Even if it's 10, 20, 30 minutes after the meal, you can charge it's a different price bracket to mingling. So then I got called up by an old acquaintance in the January of 2008 saying, do you want to go to Edinburgh? And I said, well, I don't have a show. And he said, well, you've got 6 months to write one. And we go back to what I need is a deadline, not more time. And that was amazing. And in those 6 months, I wrote a show with no previous experience of, I mean, I'd done school productions up on stage, but no previous experience magically of, again, my big boxes at school balls, and I think I did something at the university ball, but no speaking. It was just lots of music and me in sequins and glitter and the big boxes. So this was me writing a show very much now as a mentalist. The show was called Six Impossible Things Before Dinner, which was all about manipulating people's beliefs from a mentalist point of view, and that got written. And that's perhaps now where we can, I don't know, move to the meat of this.
So there are a lot. We've talked quite a lot, of course, about the kind of the social connection aspect, and it was a really evocative picture you painted of Tony or Barry forcing himself onto a group of people that he's basically that character is kind of using the group to achieve his ends, and everyone feels kind of used. And the idea of presence and bringing your presence in a way that's amenable to the people you're approaching is really important. So I love that. But you're kind of jazz riffing on a kind of an established groove that keeps you centered. That's your kind of center of gravity. But you then had to translate that center of gravity into a show. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I would have thought that the title Six Impossible Things Before Dinner, which is a take on Alice in Wonderland, right? Six Impossible Things Before Breakfast, is that right?
Yeah, Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah, and is it the Mad March Hare that says I
The White Queen.
get everything wrong? But yeah,
No,
she
no,
says
no.
I often do six impossible things before breakfast every day, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So what can you remember the moment? Because I think that coming to that title must have felt like, oh, this is a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that felt you know when you're right, you know when something's, and at that point I could have, as we do in the creative industry, well, quite often, oh, Philip, I've just been mucking around with a few chords, just tell me what you think, kind of thing. I didn't need to do that with that. I didn't care what anyone else thought, and as it went out there, a few people said, "Oh, a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?" Yeah, yeah, and but it just nothing could chip away at my sense of this is right. And you've got to be a bit careful with that sort of assuredness, because as the ship is now sinking, because it's the worst title that's ever been created, and you're sort of, as your face goes beneath the surface of the water, but it was a brilliant title. So you have to be a bit careful, but being very certain in something is a good feeling. And as it turned out, my certainty was well placed. I still have the list somewhere of all the titles that were being batted around at the time.
Yes. So the title, Six Impossible Things Before Dinner, it's great because it's got heritage that's taking from Lewis Carroll. It's great because it's got a number, so that gives you a defined sort of objective for you to produce, but also for the audience to kind of count through, as it were. And the fact that it's an evening, I think an evening show at Edinburgh, right? So before dinner,
Yeah.
it just works really well, and really logistically, like people walking around the fringe around Edinburgh Festival trying to plan their day out. You're giving people a sort of a slot of their day that you can occupy without impeding into other areas that make me less comfortable. It's gorgeous, and of course, it's got that promise of surreality of being taken to a different dimension of experience. So just love.
For those that were aware of the Lewis Carroll origin, that was a nice place for it to come from, because Lewis Carroll has that absurdist, quirky, surrealist, magical kind of, you get a free shot of that into
Yeah.
your experience without doing much heavy lifting.
I mean, just the way the phrase is structured, Six Impossible Things Before Dinner, even that is quirky, and it wrong foots you mentally in a way that whets the appetite, I think, really nicely. I even kind of, you probably won't necessarily hold with that, but even if people don't know where a thing has come from, there's something of the soul of the original.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
The source of the original thing that somehow translates itself across, you know, and in this case, I think, the word structure, it promises a lot that keeps the truth of the original statement going. I'm going on a bit, but I think that
No, I get it. It's too well constructed for it to come just from me.
right.
I think
No offense.
this has higher provenance
Yes.
than the bloke in the room doing it. Now, whether you know where it comes from, or even if you consciously know that it has a richer quality to it than perhaps this unheard of performer could do on their own, on some subconscious level, I think. But anyway, it was a good title. It worked.
Yeah.
And it certainly did the job.
So you had your 6-month deadline. At some point in those 6 months, you landed on a title and probably went, phew, that must have felt like base camp, first flag in the ground. And then you had however much time you had left, and you also had defined 6, which is probably quite a good number for a 40-minute show. 40 minutes, was it?
1 hour.
1 hour. 6, yeah, 6. That gives you time to establish yourself in the show, but to work through at not too breathless a pace to a big conclusion. You had, what did you have? You had structure, but you didn't have an arc. So you might, I presume you worked to a big finish, right? The last illusion is going to be the big one. So
Yeah.
how much connection was there between the six different pieces?
As much as there is a connection between 12 pieces of music on an album, I would say. Is there, sorry, going back to the title, the one other thing that tickled me about it is this quite known maxim in our world of, and this was only for other magicians, not really the audience, but a professional magician knows 6 different tricks that they do to thousands of different people, and an amateur magician, that also just, okay, there's another sort of stone in the circle that's making it even more impenetrable and tight and solid. The finish was very important, and this caused a certain debate between me and the powers that be. I wanted an absolutely anticlimactic ending.
Of course you did.
Yeah. Just because, we've all seen tricks where the magician puts his head in a guillotine and there's a carrot either side and the blade comes down and he's proved it's sharp because it's cut 2 carrots before, 2 new carrots get put in, the blade comes down and his head's still there and the 2 carrots get cut. And to me, the second that guillotine is revealed, the only thing that interesting that can happen is the magician's head gets cut off. And that never happens. And so there's sort of the dull inevitability of certain magic tricks. The second a magician shows a box empty, right? Spoiler. So I wanted to do anything to sort of buck the trend, but you have to stay commercial. You have to give people, you need, especially at festivals. I don't know how much you've been to places like the Edinburgh Fringe or the Melbourne Comedy Festival, but there's 3,000 shows on every day at Edinburgh, and you're in a venue, and the shows start at 10 in the morning. There's one from 10 till 11, 11 till 12, 12 till 1, all the way through. I was 5 till 6, or 20 past 5 till 20 past 6, and then it's 20 past. And there's a queue of people outside your venue waiting to come in for the next show, and there's a load of people coming out of your venue as your queue of people are waiting to go in. And then there's a sort of, you might be next to another venue and that's got its own queue. There's a lot of people milling around. So if you leave a room full of people going, it's not going to make the people around go, what was that show? I really want to go and see that show. So I was persuaded to sort of have a halfway point. I don't know how much of this to go into, and I'm not sure how much it's to do with flow state, really. But yes, there was a big finish, but a big finish that happened in the hands of the spectators after the show had finished, which for a performer and my ego is slightly antithetical in the sense that I made a big thing about this prediction that had been hanging up above the stage right from the beginning, and we'd eliminated that this prediction could be right. The only way it could be right is if I'm psychic, but 80% of you don't believe in psychics. Well done, quite rightly, but then it can't be right. And sure enough, at the end, I turned this board around and it's wrong. And I'm like, well, what the fuck? You knew it was going to be wrong. You told me at the beginning of the show, just because you've seen 5 impressive things doesn't suddenly mean I can do things that you knew an hour ago were nonsense. I've really sort of squashed that all up. But they get given something, a little fortune cookie, and you can do the maths. So this happens, and you get these little squeals of delight after the show. Sometimes it's very deferred, the squeal. Sometimes it's people have put this fortune cookie on the front passenger seat, and 2 weeks later, I had emails. I was driving to work, and oh my God, I ate the fortune cookie, and inside this, what? And that's lovely.
That's lovely, yeah.
But mainly the squeals were happening outside because they got given a fortune cookie as I invited to come up onto the stage and take one as they left, and that happened. But the show itself didn't have a big denial moment. It had a sort of, but it wasn't. I used to gurn a bit when I turned the board round. I used to be, and actually it evolved into me being much more stoic. I just turned it round and was there. What do you want? I was much harder, and that worked much better than me being slightly apologetic for it. And so that evolved. But that was the big finish. And then we had to populate it with 5 other things in between, which all hung on the hook of belief systems. I did one trick about horoscopes. I did one trick that involved, those sort of pick a number, pick a colour, open it up, you smell of poo kind of things that you did in the playground. I did a really bad sort of comic tarot routine that was just so clearly general and horrible, and really uncomfortable for the audience as it was just getting worse and worse. And then, of course, there's a sucker punch ending, which was good and clever, and a few other things.
But they were all
Um,
of a piece and all relatable from people's lives. People know what a
yeah,
tarot deck is,
yeah.
or what the
And just like an album, you want your quieter tunes, you want your faster pace, you
yeah.
want you want a bit of light and shade.
But you presented the show and have presented your shows as being a kind of a live experiment. So that's a really nice sense of invitation. But I don't know, it's not really necessarily very true, that is it? It's just
I don't know where that's come from. I saw you'd written that in something you sent me before we did this. I'm not sure where that's come from, this live experiment.
because it
No.
makes, like, ostensibly makes a kind of a sense that it's like let's discover how our minds work together, and but you know, and so I think it's probably one of your promoters kind of adding some padding and dressing around your brand, probably.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I mean, there was a sort of slightly social experiment right at the end before I turned the board round, which I've now told you didn't have the prediction on it because we'd established it couldn't possibly. I offered people the opportunity to leave now. Don't. Why are you staying to look at a board that you know is wrong? It's a waste of time. It's all that's going to happen between now and the end of the show. You could leave now, avoid the rush. What do you want to do? I want to stay. Why? Well, I'm interested. Curious. Curious. Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, let's see how curious. What about if I gave you
I
£50? And I
remember
would offer
this.
them.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and then sometimes this would go up to sort of £600, 700, and sometimes I gave them 50. I never gave them £600. There was a funny line to get myself out of that. I love the visceral moment, the real theatre of this person saying, "What, 50 quid now to leave?" Yep, you'll never find out what was on the other side of that board, just so you know. I've got it covered. No one will tell you, not even, is that your partner? Yes, she will. She just trust me on this. She will not tell you what was on the other side of that board. You will never know, but you will have my eternal undying admiration for not letting curiosity make you believe in nonsense. And I'd give them the 50 quid and off they'd go, and I'd give them a round of applause. Anybody else, and that was nice. That was quite dramatic and variable and experimental, I suppose. But I never build it as a sort of live experiment.
There's a great immediacy to that, isn't there? So, I mean,
Mm.
going back in time, but when we watch Whose Line Is This Anyway, I'm thinking of, like, in improv, the comedy isn't necessarily the funniest comedy you ever see, but the very fact that it's happening immediately in the moment, that sense of this could go this way or that way, who knows? Where it goes, nobody knows. That
Yeah,
is high entertainment. It's really engaging, and I remember when I saw the show in London. I remember the power of that offer to just leave and not find out. And what's really nice is you're making it really clear that you're beginning to make it really clear that when you turn the board around, you're going to be disappointed as well. This isn't going to, And I love the after. What would you call it? The kind of the coda that happens once the show's over and people get that extra reward. It's again,
yeah,
it has a strangely personal dimension to it. It's in their hands. They're opening it, and they're each having their own personal
yeah,
experience
yeah.
of the big finish. It's really good. So it seems like watching you perform. It seems like you just don't know where anything might go. Who knows what a volunteer might say or do? And you deal quite a lot with the idea of cold readings, partly as a way of poo-pooing psychics that kind of make statements that sound specific but are actually general enough for someone to go, "Oh yeah, that's me. I had an Uncle Barry that died in the war." But are you asking questions where you really don't know the answer, or are you like a barrister where you kind of know what people are going to? You've got people in much tighter guardrails than they might think they have.
Yeah, yes, it's definitely the latter. I'm not asking them any questions that I don't know what the range of answers might be, and I'm ready for
Yeah,
all eventualities.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And so there you were. I guess let's just go back to the six possible things before dinner, or stay there for a minute. So, in terms of putting that together, you how did you piece it together? Because I'm obviously this podcast is all about inspiration and staying in the space of inspiration and of productive, effective use of that, sort of the stitching together of all of these pieces of inspiration. And as a creative person, I think, for me, ideas don't never come whole. They never come as the whole cloth. They're fragmentary. And for me, I kind of try and capture fragments and see what works. And sometimes I might go, "Oh, this is a nice set of chords," or "That's a nice sort of single lyric line, but I don't know where to stick it. So it stays in my mental sort of the shed of riffs in my head that and sometimes I'll have a tune from 10 years ago that works with a new tune I've just written, and I've got a verse and a chorus suddenly. So I use a notebook. I kind of keep notes and sort of mounds of paper that I sort of try and bring together. How do you go about it? How do you go about giving
Let me ask
form
you a question.
to your fragments of inspiration?
You create personally for your music, and you create professionally in your role as a creative. In your role as a creative, you have a deadline. In your role as a musician, you don't. I'm not aware you've ever had a deadline musically. So you have this luxury that you can take a riff that's perfectly good and serviceable and put it into the shed. This assumes your shed is well archived and catalogued, and that lovely riff full of potential doesn't sort of get lost forever. The point I'm leading to is, I think if you had a deadline, that riff wouldn't go in the shed. If you had a deadline, you'd take that riff and you would make something out of it. And that would be a product of sorts. And then it would go through the polishing and buffing and slightly remolding and all the things that happen between, okay, this is my prototype and this is the finished article, and there's a time period of months or sometimes even years. A lot of the people I work with in The Illusionist, they would talk frequently about the germ of an idea to it being a good, solid stage piece being between 2 and 3 years.
Right.
Now, that varies, I'm sure. But so I've always thought, it's analogous to if I had to decorate a room, design a room. I'm not an interior designer, but let's imagine, you've got so many questions that need answering. What color the walls are going to be? Is the skirting board going to be the same color as the walls? We're going to have a central light, or is it going to be up lights around the curtains, the upholstery on the fabric, on the sofas, all these kinds of things. And I've always thought, well, if I've got a vase that I really, really like, and that vase has a certain shape, but more importantly, perhaps certain colors in it, and that goes in the middle of the room, now that informs so many things. Now, because that vase is there in place, and perhaps analogous to that is your riff, because that riff is now in place, none of these notes are applicable, really, unless I want something particularly discordant or unless I deliberately, we're working in this scale, it's a minor key or it's whatever. And similarly, I've got these colors now that I have to work with them. Pink is no longer available because it just doesn't go. And that's, I think, how I work, knowing that I had a deadline. I had to have something up and running for the first preview in July, and then the run in Edinburgh is August. And there was a lot then, after the first two previews, a lot of getting rid. It overran horribly, as often these things do. It was far too wordy. I make the mistake of assuming people have lived in my brain for the last however many decades that I have, and they haven't. So it's clunky. It's not economical in any way word-wise. But the A point is there and the B point are there, and that's important. So I think there's a big difference between creating with no time frame and creating with a time frame.
I guess also you had your promoter, agent, watching those previews and giving you that objectivity, which must have a huge impact. Just as any author has an editor, and the Beatles had Brian Epstein. There's always someone that's not in it, but is close enough to it to kind of go,
Yeah.
that thing you're really in love with, you need to kill that, like kill your babies,
Yeah. I had this trick which was all about, there was a famous scientist mathematician in the 19th century, I think, called John Napier, and he gave us the slide rule and the decimal point, I think, but there'll be people putting me right on that, but it doesn't really matter. Broadly, that's what he did. And this apocryphal story about how he decided to get rid of the servant working in his house who he knew was stealing from him. And he always carried this sooty, no, he didn't carry soot. He carried this black cockerel around with him. Why, I don't know. It was part of his heraldic crest. He was a bit weird, but he had this cockerel, and he convinced his staff that this cockerel had special abilities, that if you put your hands on it, it knew whether they were honest hands or thieving hands. And one of you six is stealing from me. the cockerel's in that room over there. I want you to go in. It's pitch black in there, but he'll be in one of the corners. Just go up to him and just put your hands on him. And that's all I need you to do, and then come back out. The long and the short of it is he covered the cockerel in black soot. And the one person who came out without soot on his hands was the thief, because they bought into the idea that this cockerel did have powers, so they didn't want to touch it. So they just came out saying they had touched it. And I thought that was a lovely idea for a particular routine I had. It was awful. And I was so wedded to it. And I'd made this little gadget, electronics, that sort of you pressed it and it said whether you were lying or it was all, I'd done so much work. And it's so hard to go, yeah, doesn't matter. It's rubbish. It's not rubbish. No, that's not right. It's just not right. It doesn't work. Now, maybe with a lot of reimagining and going back to the drawing board, there is still the germ, the central vase is still in there. But my goodness, you've used all kinds of colours with it that just don't go. It's wordy, it's inaccessible, it's horrible. So we needed a new impossible thing after that first preview.
You actually took it to the preview, to the stage, and you took it that far.
Yeah. It was only doing it on the first night that I didn't need anybody. I mean, just the blank looks on a room full of people.
Yeah,
that was feedback enough to know this.
yeah. I mean, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, in advertising, you've got a creative director, and you take your ideas to the creative director, and sometimes they're really brutal. I didn't have this, but there was one creative director that a friend of mine worked for, and they'd sort of hold up the piece of paper with the scribble on it, and the stick people and the headline, and the creative director would just take the piece of paper and put it into a shredder behind him without any expression on his face, and go next. And
Yeah.
but really, what the creative director does best, if they're any good, is they go, I mean, the cliche is, I see what you've done here, but there's a germ, there's something about this bit has something. This bit tells this human truth that resonates for me. The rest of it, I can't do anything with, but make more of this bit. And I think that's what any good editor, commenter does before the critics are there to really tear you down, because you want all this to be out the way before you go properly live, right?
Yeah, it's much better that a few well-intended friends point out the shortcomings than it getting splashed all over the Scotsman.
Yeah. When I play a new song to my wife and she says, the chorus isn't good enough, I often I sometimes have to go and have a stomp around the garden and sort of calm myself down, because the chorus is fine. How can you criticize that? And then over time, the gift of this other person's objectivity kind of slowly filters in with me, and I go, maybe I could do that a bit better.
I mean, she could put it differently. She could go, the verse is really good.
I think she knows she has to be a bit more frank with me than that. So anyway, let's carry on. So you went from a solo stage show, rave reviews at Edinburgh and on tour, to then joining an ensemble, the Illusionists, which was really quite big,
Yeah.
sort of widescreen, big glossy posters, characters. Just as the name suggests, you might think of any set of superheroes like the Incredibles or something, the Avengers. It was kind of that sort of a framing, wasn't it? Where there was, I guess, loosely speaking, the varying degrees along the spectrum of what illusion and magical performance entails, and you occupied the mentalist space within that. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot in that, isn't there? So how did it come about? First of all, it was just an invitation. Your name was growing, and you were invited to join up, right?
A big dollop of luck, really. Is it Gary Player who said the more I practice, the luckier I get? So probably some element of that, but luck nonetheless. In a parallel universe, there's someone every bit as deserving, but just didn't have that dollop of luck. And the dollop of luck was my publicist at the time, Australian woman who had been amazing working on my show in Australia, which initially hadn't been going well at all. But rather than just sort of saying, look, I've done everything I can, good luck, but I'm out of this, just carried on way beyond what could be reasonably expected, and turned it round, which then led to me doing my own show at the Opera House. But that wasn't on the cards initially. So she was amazing, but she also did the publicity for one of the big four venues up at Edinburgh and would fly into Heathrow to go up to Edinburgh for the month. And this would be in 2011. She was on the way back out to Australia, staying at our house in northwest London for a night, and was sat at our kitchen table and got a phone call, and I heard her saying to the person on the other end, "Oh, guess whose kitchen table I'm sitting at?" And I imagined the person said, "I had no idea." And she went, "Philip Escoffey," and she tells me he went, Philip Escoffey. Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think of it. He was somebody from the Opera House. The Illusionist was a co-production between two producers working out of America and Sydney Opera House. And it was this new concept, a bit sort of Cirque du Soleil, Blue Man Group, kind of big endeavor. And they'd cast 6 of these 7 illusionists. They'd cast the big box motorcycle appearing chap. They'd cast the manipulator, the person who does exquisite things with cards, the pickpocket, the sort of anti conjurer, Marilyn Manson-esque dove guy. Lots of the stalls were now populated. They didn't have this mentalist character. And I had done my own show at the Opera House 2 years previous to that. And the guy had obviously gone, "Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think of Philip Escoffey." And that got me into the Illusionists. I was the last one to be cast. So there were 5 Americans, myself, and a charming Italian escapologist called Andrew Basso. And we did that. And I did that for 2 years and then left it, much to the consternation of many of my friends, just before it went to Broadway. But I'd done my thing there, and my first son was about to be born, and I didn't want to be away all the time, and that's when I hung up my magic wand. So that's how that came about. A lucky phone call, because had this lady Kelly been sat at my table the day before, I don't think she'd have said, "Guess whose kitchen table I'm going to be sitting at tomorrow?" And equally, had it come in the day later, I don't think she'd have said, "Guess whose kitchen table I was sat at yesterday?" So in that sense, there's a big dollop of luck.
Yes, for sure. Although the more you're in the arena, the more your face is seen, and you were out and about, up and at it. He was already aware of your work previously. There was a lot of other
Yeah,
dots.
I was ready for it.
Yeah,
when that luck came my way.
yeah,
I don't know how interesting this is and how germane to the notion of flow state it is, really, but that led to the first performance of that at Sydney Opera House. So that my show at Sydney Opera House was in it's a bit like the National Theatre Complex in London. You've got at the Opera House 2 main stages, those 2 big sails you see. One is the concert hall and one is the opera theatre, and then you have 3 or 4 other various sized venues within there. So my own show was in a little 500 seater. The Illusionist was in the main concert hall, which is, I don't know how many thousand, but 3 or 4,000, huge cavern of a place. And that led, I'd never been physically sick with worry before, but I was, because I'd spent a number of months devising a new effect which was specifically for that show and for that venue, but there just wasn't the rehearsal time. It was chaotic. They had dancers in the show. The venue wasn't right in any way. So much, a lot of things that were anticipated came along, which meant that days and days of what was meant to be rehearsal time wasn't available anymore. So there we were with 24 hours to go, and this trick that I had created hadn't been rehearsed, it just wasn't doable in the time that I'd been given. So what do I do? And I defaulted back to doing a routine, which was the 5th impossible thing in my show, which I didn't want to do. And then I became saddled with doing that every night, and it didn't feel like the right thing in that it went very well and people liked it, and all fine, but artistically, creatively wasn't what I wanted to be doing. Over time, I persuaded them to let me do a different thing. We tried it again in Dubai, and I thought it went really well. But at that point, the producers were raking it in. We were playing stadia of tens of thousands of people. It wasn't the sort of show I liked being in, really, because the vast majority of the people weren't watching us. They were watching us on screens, and it was very impersonal. So it was very far away from being in any kind of flow state. A lot of it wasn't right. And cynically, if I was a shareholder, I'd do exactly what the producers were doing, which was, look, we're selling out to in every country we're going to. Why are we going to spend money? Because it costs money to work up a new effect. You've got to get the crew in, and there's a cost to it. Why would we do that? There was an amazing guy in it called Kevin James who played the character of the inventor, and he came up with this brilliant new effect. And they went, "Yeah, it's not great, is it?" Well, no, it's the first time I've ever done it. The thing you love, I've been doing it for 25 years. Of course it's, but you know, going forward, we need to start developing new material to put into this show. And he'd spent thousands of dollars of his own money developing this new effect, and it got one airing, much like my effect in Dubai. I hadn't spent thousands, I'd spent a lot of time and some money on it. And the sadness was both my effect and Kevin's were really good, but they weren't magic producers, these two guys, so they didn't really have an understanding that no, it's clearly not as immediately dynamic and polished as the things you've seen. But yeah,
And yeah, you've spoken
no
just. I was going to ask about. I was presuming creative frustrations come with scale, don't they? On the one hand,
yeah.
you've lost your personal connection, which is so much at the heart of the kind of work you do, and you were able to maintain that to quite a surprising degree with Six Impossible Things, with your solo show. But by the time you're playing Stadia and people are watching you on a screen, you've broken the chain, haven't you? It can't be fixed. And then on the other hand, the generative need to kind of keep something fresh, and they missed a trick. They missed an understanding of the need for creative performers to be constantly developing, because they would have kept everyone. They would have probably kept the show on the road more successfully and happily if they'd have embraced this.
Well, the reality is, and my numbers might be off here, but I mean, at one point, I think there were 3 or 4 iterations now of The Illusionist at any given time going around the world. This is after I'd left it.
Right.
When I left it, it was still just one, but they already had the next show with also the 7 greatest magicians in the world. I mean, how many 7 greatest magicians in the world there are, I don't know. But and this is why I say I'm not sure of my numbers, but the whole franchise was sold to Cirque du Soleil a number of years ago now, but many years after I left, for 7-figure sums.
Wow.
So actually, it's done very well. Their philosophy is very much the Vegas philosophy. You don't change the show, you constantly change the audience.
Right. Right. Well, it's a nice feather in the cap. You've kind of reached the dizziest.
Amazing. I had the most amazing time. It's allowed me to, be the dad I want to be, a stay-at-home dad. I genuinely really liked all the other performers I was working with. And when you're touring for 2 years, that helps a lot, because if you don't get on with them, it can be quite a lonely experience. But I really enjoyed their company. I learned a huge amount watching some of the other performers, just their artistry, their absolute sort of flow state. And we can expand on that a bit if you want. But it was an amazing experience, but it did become the very thing that I'd left my job in marketing. It became mundane. It became a going to work thing. There was nothing of me really in that show. I was a piece in a puzzle. I was a cog in a machine. I was very replaceable. And that's all fine. But there came a point where I didn't want to do it anymore. But it's still going great guns. I've got a number of friends who are in current iterations of it, and they're it's doing very well.
Well, yeah, let's talk briefly about the flow state in performance. There's the flow state in creative generation of an idea away from the public eye, and there's this high level of performance. When we were talking the other day about having this conversation that we're having now, you had such a beautiful description of when things are going right, when you're really in the zone. And you said even between uttering line A and line B, pausing to take the sip of water, I think you said the sip of water, time rearranges itself around the sip of water for it to fit perfectly, something like that. Yes, you said it better than that.
Yeah, because just this, I knew something was bedded in and was now all as good as it was ever going to be, because without consciously thinking about it, the point at which I was taking a sip of water was just happening at exactly the same moment every night, without me having deliberately decided that. It just sort of in a Zen Tai Chi kind of way became the right punctuation moment to be taking that sip of water. So that was always a good sign. And I also became very mindful when I started doing a lot of performing, and I performed my own show, Six Impossible Things, hundreds of times. So you get a lot of data, that some nights I just felt so light and easy, and I was always a foot and a half in front of myself in my own head, and not in a racing way. Just I sort of had the luxury of being able to look back and see the performance come and join me where I was, and then very comfortably go to the next bit. And they were delightful, those performances. They were so easy and effortless. And then there were other nights where it was much more wading through treacle, it felt like. Now, how noticeable that is to an audience, I'm not sure. I think it is on some level. Hard for them because they tended to see the show once, so they didn't have any comparison. And regardless of how heavy or light I was finding it, they were still seeing 6 very clever things that made them go, wow. And this is the great con of magic compared to any other art form. You can be a really bad performer, but you've got a box that makes something go, da-na. So you can get away with being a bad performer. And certainly in the corporate arena, there are lots of people who wouldn't be performing successfully in any other art form, but because they've got a clever little device that makes something very spectacular happen automatically, they get away with it. Rather rudely, in the world of magicians, we say that big box illusions are God's way of letting people on stage who shouldn't really be there. And there's an element of truth. Now, there are some amazing performers who happen to be big box illusionists, but there are a lot of very poor performers who are big box illusionists. And all they're really doing is, if the door to my box is closed, my next job is to open it. And if the door to my box is open, probably my next job is to close it.
Mm.
And invariably the woman inside that box is doing the hard work.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. So whether the audience notice any difference between light, bouncy, effortless performance or much more, God, this is a slog, I've got a big weight on my back and I'm fighting to get to the next point and the next point. What caused that? That's the key, isn't it?
That's what we want to know. That's what we're here for. But it's indefinable, isn't it? I mean, it's going to have to do with when you last ate, how much sleep you've had, all the obvious. There's kind of obvious things to tick off. But it's more than that, isn't it?
Some of them.
And every audience is different too, right?
I think that's the big part of it. Okay, so some of the base things that we can tick off very easily, as you say: eaten well, slept well, well rested, got to the venue plenty of time, set up, all done, no worries. It wasn't a last minute. You didn't get to the venue in plenty of time and then get hit by somebody at the venue saying, oh, sorry, we didn't tell you about it. We've got an interview with the newspaper. We just 20 minutes. That's all it's going to be.
Yes.
It's never 20 minutes. It's half an hour, 35 minutes. That's my prep time, my getting into the zone, making sure that pocket's got that thing. Yep, good, check. All of that is part of getting you to a point where the light, effortless flow state performance is a possibility, but still not a guarantee. But yes, so there's some sort of fairly admin-y things that I've just listed that are important. But then it's slightly more intangible things. It could be knowing a particular person is in the audience that gives you either a lift or a worry. It could be an opening night and there's a really important reviewer in there that makes you then overthink it. It could be somebody you really fancy and want to impress and makes you just think about it at the right amount and give you that thing. It could be that very early on in the performance, you just get this really lovely reaction from someone in the audience you can see, or a big laugh to something you've said. You know, I imagine if you speak to comedians along this journey, a big laugh on an early bit of material is going to help contribute to getting to that lovely state. That's a thing. Getting to a point with your tech crew where you're not worrying that doorbell sound effect comes in at the right time, which for the first 4 nights, oh, there it is. Yeah. So I think everything that you have control over, that you do control properly, is a fundamental. You know, if you're going to make a cake, you need your flour, your eggs, your butter, whatever else. That's a given. Now, what makes this cake particularly light and fluffy? What height did I sift the flour from? Was that a thing? Where did this butter come from? It's not the normal stuff from, you know, maybe. So then you start going to these very small things, and could be that you've got a new jacket that makes you feel really good about yourself. Maybe, who knows? But whatever it is, I think it's not one thing. I think it's a basket of variables. And perhaps when all of them are... Oh, and of course, sorry, the other thing that's on the got to be there list of butter, eggs, milk before you can even get started is an absolute mastery of your material.
You're just well practiced.
You know,
That's like
you
number one, isn't it?
yeah,
You've done it time and time again.
yeah.
You've had that outside party saying, cut that, keep that, do more of that, be funnier. Yeah.
But beyond that, that's happened a long time ago. The material itself is now as good as it's going to get. It's economical. There's no extra words that shouldn't be there. There's enough words to make it clear. But you know, when I'm learning a piece on the piano for the first however many months, if you stop me halfway through, I have to start again at the beginning. I just can't. But there comes a point where you can stop me there. I can have a little chat and then carry on from there because it's now in my muscle memory. So that's the same, I think, with performing as a magician. It's just there. It's you can make me do it backwards. I can do it forwards. I can do it upside down. I can do it in my pajamas. I can do it. You know, anything is nothing's going to throw me off it, and that just comes with time and time. It's the 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours or whatever, however many hours of it just being so in there.
I guess yeah, well, you mentioned muscle memory, and I think there's knowing your stuff inside out cognitively, and then there's the sort of when you've totally and utterly embodied the work, and it.
Yeah.
I guess that there's the other end of the pipe is like, and perhaps this happened with the illusionist, is that you've done it so many times that maybe there comes a new challenge to stay in flow state when you've done it 100 times and keeping it
Yeah.
fresh, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in my little knowledge of the flow state, somebody sort of drew this diagram where along the x-axis you've got skill level, and then along the y-axis you've got. If I've got it here in front of me, bear with me a
It's
second.
basically
I thought it was
stress,
quite
isn't it? You
interesting.
want the right level of stress.
Yeah, yeah. So you've got challenge up your y-axis. So if it's a low challenge and you have high skill, we're in boredom territory. If it's high challenge and high skill, then you have the possibility of flow state. If it's medium challenge and high skill, then you're in relaxation. And then you go to the other place where you're low skill, high challenge, and that's just unbearable stress and anxiety. So you're quite right, because if it becomes too mundane and done, it ceases to be high challenge and high skill. It becomes medium challenge and high skill. So now you've gone down from flow state to relaxation. And then if it becomes low challenge, because you've done it so many times, it's so easy and you're so bored, you are into boredom. You can do it with your eyes shut. So yeah, it's keeping all of those variables. There's probably quite a limited window of time where, unless you're working very hard to maintain it, where you will naturally be in a place where the flow state can come. I can't imagine. I mean, this goes back to David Copperfield. He's now just clearly, I hope I'm not misrepresenting him, but I think from everything I've heard, he's just very, on some level, very bored. But I think he also wants to become the highest earning artist ever in the history of performance, which he currently is, I believe. And he's got a number. These are his new goals, but they don't involve necessarily giving a particularly passionate or sort of fresh, sparkling performance. And I hope I'm wrong. Maybe somebody will say, "Oh, I saw him a couple of weeks ago in Vegas, and it was amazing, and he was so fresh." And so maybe I've got that wrong.
Maybe, but as an
But
example,
there will be performance.
we
Sorry.
all know of we all understand the idea of going through the motions, and people might have goals to pay bills or to be the biggest, bestest ever in like empirical terms, but they're still going through the motions, aren't they? And that's not what the flow state's about. And I think, given all of those variables, it's no surprise that none of us can permanently exist in that sweet spot state. We can't always be in the zone all of the time. Let's just ask then. Let me ask you, like, I think we've talked about performance and the many things that a state of mind that's needed to be got to for a certain time when you appear on the stage. And I can certainly relate to that. I remember doing a gig once, and the bass player and the guitarist started bickering before the gig, and I really consciously remember just telling them off, which wasn't my style, but it's just like, I can't do this just before we go on. I can't have argument happen before we're talking to the public. I will feel like the legs are being pulled out from under me. And so definitely you need to be in a good, serene state of mind with mastery over your material and all of the technical
Well,
aspects covered off and so on.
some people do. I mean, look at McEnroe. If he felt he wasn't playing well, he deliberately contrived an argument with the umpire, and then just got much, much better for having done that.
That sort of was his
So
palate
it's finding what,
refresher. Yeah.
yeah, it's finding what it is for you. Now, I'm probably more like you. If I'm about to go on stage, I don't want my people arguing. That will throw me. But clearly, for someone like McEnroe, and he might be the exception, he thrived on that sort of discord and conflict. That gave him a hunger. I think he had to sort of dislike. But we're talking a much more adversarial situation where we're looking for a flow state in the sporting arena.
Mm.
And I think if you get the chance to speak to some sporting people, that will be interesting as well in terms going back to muscle memory. Because what somebody once said to me, the top 1,000 players in the world, tennis players in the world, can all hit a tennis ball as well as a tennis ball can be hit. If you watch them in practice, you won't be able to rank them. That's the best one and that's the 1,000th best. They all hit a tennis ball as well as it can be hit. It's who can hit a tennis ball as well as it can be hit on match point, on centre court, in the highest possible, with highest possible stakes in the biggest arenas. And that's the key. And there's something about that pressure that will throw people, that they overthink it. They hit the ball a tiny bit earlier than they would if they were just completely relaxed. How do you maintain that relaxation around whatever it is you're doing when the stakes and the pressure is very high? If anyone could walk along a board that wide, if it was on the floor, you put it 10,000 feet above the ground. There's no wind. It's not you're going to get blown off at high altitude. Just you start doubting your ability to walk. And that's got to have some kind of insight into what the flow state is all about. What happens in our brains when suddenly the jeopardy of, if I suddenly forget how to walk, that thing I've been doing really successfully now for decades, I've never just sort of walked along something flat and unimpeding and fallen over. And yet, if the stakes of me falling over become very, very high, I will now start doubting my ability to walk on something flat and unimpeding.
Crazy, isn't
Why?
it? It's really crazy. It's a really good example. We can all relate to that. So yeah, the high wire act of performance, it is a high wire act, but sometimes you just trip along the wire completely without incident. And there's a lot that, as we said, you cover off those bases and you're there. But back to the kind of behind the scenes prep, creative generation, do you have any rituals or things you need to do? For me, I tend to need to have a cup of tea. I tend to need to have a clear space to work in. Too much chaos prevents me. What are your kind of go-tos? What are your top tips for coming up with good
For
work? Creating, yeah.
Yeah, distraction free, and there's a time element for me there too. Most of my creating happens in the small hours of the morning because there are literally no distractions. There's nobody having more fun than me. They're in bed, tucked up away, and I like that feeling of not missing out. It's something I'm just removing another potential obstacle in my brain. There's no part of my brain going, oh, I wonder what Piers is up to at the moment. No, Piers is asleep. It's fine. You can't go and play with Piers at the moment, so forget about that. Yes, clearing all distractions, you know, physical, not having a Game Boy next to you. Game Boy, sorry kids, that was a device you could play things on many years ago. I don't know why I picked a Game Boy. But yes, nothing funner for me. I don't want anything more fun than the thing I'm meant to be doing in my sight.
Yeah. Because I think that a creative mind is often a very distractible one. You know, that's a hazard that goes with the turf, right? I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that feeling that if I don't get this done, it's going to be really, really awkward and embarrassing. That focuses the mind too, I guess. So that goes back to a deadline. I think a deadline is just the most important thing. And how you create an artificial deadline if there isn't really one there, I'm not quite sure. I'm telling lots of people I'm going to be doing this. Now that can go two ways for me. I make the mistake sometimes of thinking, oh, I've told 10 people I'm going to do it. That's as good as doing it. That'll do. But actually, more often than not, I've said to 10 people I'm going to give up smoking. I've said to 50 people I'm going to give up smoking. It now becomes more difficult to not give up smoking than not.
So that's
because I've committed.
You're kind of nudging yourself, aren't you? Sort of nudging yourself forward, and maybe telling 10, 20, 30 people that you've got to do this thing. I mean, I find with deadlines, sometimes like my mind drives me crazy. If I have like a work deadline and it's really important, a part of me rebels and just downs tools, even though it's like, I've got to have 3 ideas by this evening for this important brand that's being presented in 2 days' time. And if I don't come up with those ideas, I'm a dead man. And then I'll find myself walking the dog instead of sitting down and doing the work. So I don't know.
Okay.
There's a bit of me that if it's too much pressure, I just go, sod off.
Yeah, yeah. There's that too, I guess. Um, I was when I went from being employed to freelance, and I I had to set my own targets and trajectory, and there was no one else doing that for me. I knew I'd have periods where I was quite productive and would get on with things. And I knew that at some point that would stop. And inevitably, you go into a bit of a trough in terms of self motivation and productiveness. And I started getting into the habit when I was in a slightly higher phase of getting on with it, of putting things into the diary, setting little spark plugs along the way in my future, so that when I did come to that inevitable barren, less sort of productive phase, the productive me had already done something to make things happen. So I would arrange to go and see agent, or not agent, a new event organizer in 2 weeks' time.
Mm.
So even if I was watching a lot of daytime TV and staying in bed until 2 in the afternoon, I did have that meeting at 3 o'clock in Bracknell that I had to go to. So that's something I had to do. And that's a very mundane thing, but just making promises. I'll let myself down with absolute reliability, but I find it harder to let other people down. Not because I'm a good person, I just don't like the social awkwardness or the embarrassment. So I would put things in place where if I then didn't do it, I'd be letting somebody else down and they would think badly of me. And I didn't like people thinking badly of me. I still don't.
That's really smart. I think with the distractibility thing, I don't know how you feel about this. Like in advertising, you get a brief, a written brief. That's the problem on a single piece of A4 paper. And I find that it's often in the liminal, if that's the right word, the transitions between staring at the problem and then doing something completely different. That's often when an inkling or a spark or a germ of an idea can sort of begin. And so I try and embrace distractibility, but within kind of healthy parameters. I sort of look at it, look at the problem, look away, look at the problem, look away, and do that, a bit of that. Does that resonate for you?
Yeah. Yeah. You're thinking about it, but you're not looking straight at it.
Right. Yeah.
So playing the piano, which is a relaxation for me, is always a good thing because it takes enough of my brain up to not get too deep into something else, but not so much of my brain that I can't think about nice, gentle thing. Bath time, always a very good place for creativity for me. It's away from everything. It's quiet. It's calm. It's if you got a couple of candles instead of a horrible bright light. That for me is a nicer thing. Um, yeah, I mean the common thread in all of this is a lack of external distraction, and that's a lot easier to create if you're not worrying about how your next gas bill is going to get paid, or whether your best friend is sleeping with your partner, or any of these other things it's hard to stay creative. And this goes back to the base sort of, this is before you've even got flours, eggs and butter to make your cake. Have I got the money to get flour, eggs and butter? Because if that's your first port of call, we're a long way from a flow state. And that's just luck, isn't it? Because there are people born on this world who have a very hard sort of entry ramp onto the highway.
Yeah, that takes you back to the passion to want to do it. Like, Eminem, the rapper, he didn't have much opportunity to do what he wanted to do, but he just was obsessed and he just was always scribbling down lyrics. And
Yeah,
there are people that just have the hunger, and that's a whole other
yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I think we should draw this to a close. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Unless there's anything else you'd like to say. Before we go, what are your plans for the future? Do you have any?
Plans for the future.
Professional
Yeah, I
or
mean, I've got
otherwise?
two young boys, so my plans for the future are inextricably linked with their futures, I guess, now at this stage. My wife, whose career was rudely interrupted by having children, just as her career in musical theatre was getting going, she's a bit younger than me, has now had a resurgence. That our youngest boy is in his second year at school. That's whilst he was still just a mewling, puking child suckling at the teat, that was harder for Elise to get back to. But now that he's a viable little human, I'm much more Mr. Dad. So my plans are for my continued contentedness with brief periods of happiness and even fewer of delirium, good delirium, trying to keep Yeah, it's a very mundane answer, really, but I don't like stress, so I spend a lot of time investing in avoiding stress, trying to preempt it and nip it in the bud before that comes, because I don't like it. It doesn't do well for me. And keeping myself content, because that makes me pleasant to be around. And if I'm pleasant to be around, then my family are more likely to be content too. I can't control their contentedness, but I can perhaps be an ingredient around them that is conducive to it.
Hmm. Well,
Oh, and I want to take over the world. That as well.
it sounds like you have reached a point of great wisdom and of great usefulness to Elise as she embarks on her second wind, should we say, of her profession.
First proper one. I
Yeah.
mean, she was still a student at university when we met performing in Melbourne. So this is her first proper go at it as an adult, not just being swept along by a tide. The tide being a group of like-minded performers that she became part of, and they did their thing, and it was very good. But then this is her very proactively sort of striving to be her own thing.
Well, maybe we can talk to Elise in the future as she's at this stage of putting a new show together and putting it on stage in London. It would be really good to hear her perspective. So put in a word for
Yeah,
me, and I'll cross my fingers that maybe we can do that soon. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
splendid.
Just
Thank you.
endless gems, such a rich collection of riches that you've
Oh,
shared with us.
stop it. Stop it.
I owe you. The world of magic owes you. Thank you so much, Philip, and I'll see
Take
you.
care.
Take care. All right. Thanks very much. Bye bye.